Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to those of you who are on the West Coast, good afternoon to those of you who are on the East Coast, and welcome to Transport Action Canada's annual general meeting for 2020. We usually hold our annual general meetings in the spring, meeting in Ottawa or another major city. Of course, that wasn't possible this year, even after waiting for a few months. So for the first time, we're holding this meeting online. As many of you know, Transport Action Canada was founded in 1976 to promote sustainable public transport for all Canadians and be a voice of the passenger of the then newly created Via Rail. We were originally called Transport 2000 Canada, but the millennium has come and gone and many Canadians still don't have access to reliable public transport. Unless you live in our major cities, you've probably seen services cut or even lost entirely. Since the cuts to Via Rail in the 1980s and 1990s, Canadians have watched the rest of the world invest, while we stand apart. When we talk to our friends and to our politicians about Canada needing more buses and trains and support for Transport Action Canada, the why is important. Better public transportation is not a niche concern, a single issue standing apart from the other challenges we face in our day-to-day lives as communities and as a country. It is a means of achieving those goals and empowering people to overcome those challenges. Buses and trains allow us to connect to each other, to visit relatives, to attend medical appointments, pick up groceries, go to school or to college, to get to work, to do business, and more besides. When we take a bus or train, we gain back our time rather than having to keep our eyes on the road for hours at a time. That's if we have a choice. Many Canadians are not drivers or car owners. Having access to dependable and affordable transportation is freedom. Too often, public transport suffers when governments tighten the purse strings. And that's often a false economy. Transport poverty leads to physical poverty, increased living costs, loss of jobs, social exclusion, even increased physical risks. Cuts lead to less livable and attractive communities, both for people and businesses. And that costs the Treasury and our country far more in the end. Investing in better public transport makes our communities more connected, inclusive, and sustainably productive. But public transport is not just about building more livable communities. We saw this spring how critical public transport is for frontline workers, nurses and doctors, and also for the people who kept our grocery store shelves full. And we know that for many of our compatriots, having access to reliable public transport is about building communities not just livable, but survivable. Each of us today is joining this meeting from the traditional territories of one or more of the many First Nations that have inhabited this land for thousands of years, before the colonial era, before the building of the railways, and before Confederation. The land where I live today, and where I'm speaking from this afternoon, is part of the traditional territory of the Shinabeg people, named the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. These indigenous nations agreed through their ancestral languages to mutual sharing of land, with obligations and responsibilities to the environment. Today, these responsibilities and obligations extend to all peoples. As we commit to working in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across Canada, let us be aware of how finding transportation solutions together is deeply woven into the process of building a better future. In Reclaiming Power and Place, the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, republished on June 3rd, 2019, the following call for justice was among the 231 made. We call upon all governments to ensure that adequate plans and funding are put in place for safe and affordable transit and transportation services and infrastructure for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit LGBTQ people living in remote or rural communities. Transportation should be sufficient and readily available to Indigenous communities and in towns and cities located in all the provinces and territories in Canada. These plans and funding should take into consideration ways to increase safe public transit, ways to address lack of commercial transit available, and special accommodations for fly-in, northern, and remote communities. If we commit to addressing this call to action, we'll be creating a system that provides safe and dependable transportation to every community in Canada, and everyone in Canada will benefit from it. In having the conversations, nation to nation and person to person, to co-create solutions that genuinely work for everyone, we will walk the path toward reconciliation. The Gourdain Railway, and to shoot in transportation are examples of First Nations leadership. Hopefully, the Matawaska Autobahn project to restore passenger service on the Oklahoma Central route, which is led by the Missinaibi Cree First Nation, will soon join them. At a recent panel organized by Transport Futures, the question was posed as to whether public transportation in itself is a human right. It may not explicitly appear in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the panel wrangled with the idea because fulfillment of so many rights like education, healthcare, social contact and inclusion, gainful employment, even access to affordable food, are contingent on being able to get someplace, or much easier to provide for our communities, for everyone, if we can reliably get to them. Providing safe access to safe and dependable mobility for all Canadians is therefore most certainly a responsibility that all our governments should fulfill. Our guest speakers today are going to be talking about how advances in technology are making that commitment easier to deliver at a lower cost with more personalized service than ever before. The past year has actually seen an explosion in the number of on-demand transit pilot projects across Canada and several full deployments. And the Government of Ontario has now tied the second tranche of Safe Restart funding for public transit agencies to a requirement that agencies and municipalities consider on-demand and flexible microtransit services. Our first guest speaker is Kristoffer Hansen, co-founder and chief executive of Vancouver-based transit technology company Spare. At Spare, Kristoffer is leading a technology-driven team aiming to accelerate the shift towards efficient and accessible mobility by enabling anyone to plan, launch, and analyze a smart transportation network. A native of Norway, Kristoffer moved to Canada to pursue his bachelor's degree in integrated engineering at UBC in 2010. Kristoffer, I'm going to hand the floor to you now.
Thanks, Terry. Cool. All right, so let me share my screen here. Thanks everyone for joining on a Saturday. Let's see if I can. I think you have to stop screen sharing, Terry, for me to. Cool. All right, thanks everyone for joining. So I thought I would, there's a lot of people who actually, let me take off my screen share a little bit. So there's a lot of people who talk about like all of the exciting things that are going on in Europe in terms of mobility and all over the world, right? But we've come to see in the work that we've done across multiple different continents. We work across, we're based in Vancouver, but we work across the US, Europe, and the latest being in Asia, specifically in Japan. We've come across a number of different really interesting projects that we really think should deserve a lot more attention than they do. So I thought, for the purpose of kind of some of the things that you guys are talking about, that Transport Action Canada, I thought I highlight one of the really, really interesting projects we have been a part of, but also kind of how that relates to some other really interesting systems that we've seen across the world that probably have not gotten the amount of attention that they should probably get. So let me share my screen here. Cool. So what I wanted to talk to you guys today is basically one of kind of the projects that we are involved with in Dallas, Texas. So let me present my screen here. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks good.
Cool. All right, good stuff. So yeah, so I want to kind of walk you through what we have done in Dallas, Texas, and also kind of how that relates to some of the wider trends that we are seeing across the world, and some projects that probably is not well known to the majority of the world, but I think should deserve a lot more attention, especially these days as we're really looking at how to make our transportation systems as cost effective and flexible as possible. So what we are seeing as a general trend around the world is that, you know, transportation networks, this is before COVID too, but certainly within the scope of the landscape we're currently operating, is that transportation networks are moving from these medium frequency fixed routes to high frequency fixed routes covered by on-demand or demand response options. And I'm not talking about kind of one single mode of on-demand option. These can be a number of different modes, right? Like here in Vancouver and BC, where I'm sitting, you know, there are different types of bike sharing systems. There's different types of car sharing system, ride hailing, taxi, all kinds of these things. But the focus is really on kind of the fixed route network, is to really kind of bring it into more higher frequencies with BRT and light rail and whatnot, and then kind of meld the rest with different kinds of services that are more kind of customized to each individual place. So it's becoming pretty clear that the future of mobility is open, connected, and on demand. But what most people don't know is that this has actually existed in Denmark for the last 20 years. So what I want to spend the first part of my presentation on is walk you through a system called FLiX Denmark. And this might not be that well known to most people, but it's a super, super interesting system. Just a quick disclaimer. I don't have anything to do with this system other than the fact that I'm from Scandinavia. I don't have anything to do with this FLiX Denmark system, but I think as a concept, it's extremely interesting, also because of the ROI that they've seen by rolling it out in this manner. So kind of a high level view of what FLiX Denmark is. So FLiX Denmark is a nationwide demand response transportation system for the country of Denmark. So basically the entire country is supported by one common demand response transportation system. And it's a centralized IT system, know-how, and call center operation that makes different agreements with local municipalities, local social services, and a number of different entities that need transportation in a more demand response manner. It has, as I said, you know, it has over 100 municipal units with system access to this system. The real value proposition of this specific concept is that they have gone from kind of what is usually done across the world, also here in Canada, but certainly across most of the world, is going from this total provider system to be going into this brokering system, where instead of like you're working with one entity that takes care of like kind of the quote unquote full stack of transportation, meaning that they manage the call center, they do the actual physical transportation service, and you know, it's basically just one fleet of vehicles. They're going over to this very much more flexible model, a little bit more complicated to set up, yes, but much more flexible when you have it up and running, where you're brokering out trips to different types of entities depending on kind of the customized needs of those trips. So for example, if you need to send one person to go to the doctor's appointment, you're not sending a big bus to go and pick that person up. You would send a little taxi even, or a little ride-hailing vehicle or something like that. And then kind of how do you mix that together with other people that might also be going in a similar direction, not to the doctor's appointment per se, but just in a similar direction, and really figuring out how can you, on an overall efficiency, combine these different systems together and tie them together to make an overall much better and much more cost-effective solution. So the way that this works is that you have the FLiX Denmark IT and call center that kind of sitting up the top of coordinating different things. And then you have the different public transport organizations that sit kind of below that and kind of help organize that. And, you know, the equivalent thing of that would be, you know, any kind of public transit agency here in Canada would probably likely be on this, and also municipalities that are facilitating transportation and other entities that require transportation services like schools and whatnot. And then you have these providers, which there are a number of different providers, depending on kind of the location, depending on the needs of the specific user, depending on a range of different factors, and really developing this brokering concept around it. And really where you're seeing this resource optimization is that each vehicle can facilitate many types of transportation services on behalf of many entities without needing to be locked in, or quote unquote locked in or exclusive to any one of them. So for example, here in Vancouver or across most of the US, you have these customized accessible paratransit services that are only where the fleet is exclusively used only for transportation for people with disabilities and has no other real use beyond that. So the interesting thing about the Flex Denmark concept, it really opens up these different fleets to more than the core usage of that fleet. So while, you know, for example, you might have a fleet that is mostly doing school transportation, it could also be doing other types of transportation at the same time. It's not a small system. It does about, since it launched 20 years ago, it has grown substantially. And to this point, it's operating at around 6 million trips today per year, making it basically the largest on-demand, demand-responsive transportation system in the world. It's also extremely interesting from kind of a technology standpoint, where you're looking at being able to book a trip in multiple different interfaces. You know, there's a nationwide trip planner that you can use. It's unfortunately in Danish here, but you know, you can plan your to and from address. You can buy your ticket through the system, and there's a number of different interfaces that kind of tie back into this. Obviously, also possible to book over calling in and reserving and whatnot. So it's a really cool thing in terms of like how the different booking methods kind of tie together into this one system. It's a very big system with a lot of different players involved. There's 500 authorities or like entities that basically need demand for transportation services, and this could be, you know, schools, that could be transit agencies, this could be elderly care homes, this could be doctors' offices, hospitals. There's a number of different things, so over 500 of those. There's 250,000 unique individuals who will be using it any given year, taking about 6 million trips, with 5,000 vehicles and 700 hauliers, which basically means 700 different providers. So, you know, one provider could be a taxi company, or one provider could be, you know, like a mom and pop transportation provider. So it really set up as this giant marketplace that makes it really interesting to look at in terms of a concept for what can be done, how this can be done outside of Denmark. So back to something that's a little bit closer to what we do here at Spare. So we've been looking at how can we bring these really, really interesting, and I'm not saying that that a system like Flex Denmark lacks some challenges. Of course it has challenges inherently in itself. You know, it's a fairly old system, you know, it's operating on a fairly legacy technology, maybe not made for kind of the 21st century, but as a concept of itself, it's extremely interesting. And we are working with entities across the world to really kind of roll out these types of concepts, looking at how can you bring these more connected, how can you bring these more cost-efficient demand response transportation systems. One of those places is in Dallas, Texas, which most people don't really think of when they think of, like, the future of mobility. It's not the first thing people think about is Dallas, Texas, but they have done a lot down there to actually push the envelope of this, and they've really become a leader within innovation in the public transit industry, to the point where last year they won the APTA Innovation Award for the most innovative transit agency in the US. So one of the core parts of this is one of the core parts that we help Dallas Air Rapid Transit in kind of going towards this future of mobility that's open, connected, on demand. It kind of consists of a couple of different things. The first thing you got to have is a fairly open architecture, right? You got to have the ability to tie it into these different types of systems. There's going to be all kinds of different systems that need to be working together. If it's data analytics systems, if it's trip planning systems, ticketing system, all these kinds of systems. So having a fairly open architecture is kind of key to making this possible. The other thing you got to do is have the ability to have multiple providers. So one of the things that kind of I chatted about kind of what we're seeing, for example, here in Vancouver, is that you have these older models where you have a fleet of vehicles that's dedicated to this service. Well, that is great in terms of that there are vehicles available to actually take a ride. It's not the most flexible solution. So what we have really been pushing DART in Dallas to actually do is to go towards this new model where you're having basically multiple different providers operating on behalf of this. So you could have some dedicated vehicles, which tend to be paid on a per hour basis, maybe for the base supply. Then you have, a couple of private operators. This could be, large private operators, but it could also be smaller private operators. There's no real difference between them beyond having a certain quality. And then there's also these non-dedicated providers like taxis, TNCs, and these kinds of much more flexible solutions out there. And kind of one of the key things that this really enables, this much more flexible provider network, it really enables us to kind of have a much better quality of transportation service out there in terms of meeting on-time performance and meeting KPIs that are required to present a really good transportation system, and do it in a very cost-efficient manner. So one of the things you want to do if you want to have this would tend to be kind of a demand curve where you're seeing, over the scope of the full day, you're seeing, you would tend to see peaks in the peak commuting hours, which in itself is obviously a very interesting thing of looking at how does this change post-COVID, but that's a very separate conversation. So what you would see is, you would see these big peaks, and in order to facilitate these peaks of demand, you would tend to kind of oversupply in the amount of dedicated vehicles that you have, right? So in, between the hours of 6 and 7, in order to meet this demand curve right here, you maybe would have to have like, 10 vehicles, but in reality, you maybe only need like 8.5, right? So there's an inherent waste or oversupply in the system when you can only deploy one fleet, and when your fleet is very fixed like that. So one of the interesting things that DART has done in Dallas is operate kind of these dedicated and non-dedicated services in an extremely flexible manner, completely real-time, completely on demand, where you're looking at actually deliberately undersupplying the dedicated vehicle pool and then filling in the blanks, if you could say it like that, with non-dedicated vehicles like taxi, TNC, whatnot. And really what this does, it both gives a much better passenger experience because it just results in lower wait times. And then in addition to that, it also creates a much more cost-efficient manner, because you can also reserve the dedicated fleet for people who need an accessible vehicle, and then people who don't need an accessible vehicle, they can get the probably the lower cost non-dedicated service. Another thing that's really interesting to look at is kind of what I talked about in Flex Denmark, when you have the same vehicle being used for different types of services. We've been working on a number of different entities, a number of different concepts within this, and what this is kind of what we call this is co-mingling of different services, where you're looking at having one fleet of vehicles or many fleets of vehicles, but really making each seat its own service, if you can say it like that, right? Where you can actually have one vehicle that can carry people that are paratransit riders, people are NEMT riders, people are microtransit riders, people going to school, all kinds of different things, but really combining these services together, because instead of then needing, one vehicle to do the paratransit riders and one vehicle to do the microtransit riders, you can just have one vehicle for both of them. It just creates an obvious inherent efficiency. And a really interesting thing about the system in Dallas is that it's all tied together in one kind of end-to-end trip planning solution. I would almost describe it as kind of like a Google Maps on steroids, where you can, plan out your fully multimodal trip journeys that include fixed route and on-demand and all of these things, and pay for them. You can book each journey directly in this interface without needing to use other ones. So it's kind of like a one-stop shop for getting your transportation needs fulfilled across the entire Dallas area. This system is currently in Texas and Oklahoma, and coming soon to more partner agencies in the US. So yeah, thank you so much for the attention, guys. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you, Kristoffer. That was a very, very informative presentation. And we have a couple of questions that have come in. One of them is somebody mentioned that Flex Denmark currently has about 250,000 regular users, which is a relatively small share of the population. And certainly in Canada, we know there's a challenge with a lot of people who could benefit from better access to transportation don't necessarily own a smartphone with a data plan. What should communities do to ensure that on-demand and microtransit services reach everybody?
Right. I would say that I mean, I have there's always an option for, calling in to book a ride. So that's always an option. But I would say that I think lately we've really seen that internet is having access to internet is probably as important as having access to electricity. So I think there's a kind of a give and take here, where there are obviously options for people who don't have access to smartphone for using these services. But at the end of the day, I think that us as a world being so connected, these types of technologies need to be rolled out to a much, much broader sense. And then in addition to that, I think another interesting thing is that if you're leveraging these kind of more open architectures, it also opens the point of having much more customized and much more interesting ways of booking and planning these rides. So, some of the things that we've been looking at actually lately is, developing interfaces that are specific for the elderly community. We work a lot with the city of Oslo in Norway and the transit agency there, Ruter, who is developing, special booking interfaces for the elderly community. That could be, based on an iPad or something like that with a big button, or it can even be like physical booking methods. There's actually literally a button like take me to the grocery store or something like that. So I think there's a number of ways to consider how to make this doable for people without a smartphone.
All right, one more question before we move on to the next presentation. In Denmark or Dallas, are the results being aggregated to see where new routes for higher order, higher demand travel are going to be needed in future?
Yeah, so I would say, so in Denmark, as I said, we don't have much insight into this system other than the fact that I understand the language, so I can read most of the public information about the system. But I certainly know a lot more about what's going on in Dallas. And what's really interesting about that is that they are using the data that is captured through their demand responsive service that is powered by Spare to actually develop where should we put fixed routes, right? Because it's not like I'm going to come and say here that, you know, demand responsive transportation is going to solve everyone's problem, right? There's a time for that. There's a time for fixed route. You know, I'm not going to be replacing the New York subway with a demand responsive transportation system. So we're really also helping kind of, you know, the Dart and Dallas to really figure out how can they leverage the data that is captured by the system that they're using from us in order to develop potential new fixed route services.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kristoffer.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Feel free to stay on the call.
Thank you.
For our second session today, our guest speakers are Pierre Gourdain and Joanna Patterson from FLiXBUS. First bright green FLiXBUS intercity motor coach services launched in Germany in 2011 before expanding across Europe and entering the North American market in 2018. Pierre Gourdain is Managing Director and President of FLiXBUS Inc. And prior to moving to the United States, Pierre led FLiXBUS's first international expansion in France and Belgium.
So, hello everyone. It's so nice to be here with Kindred Spirits on a Saturday morning. Yeah. I'm just gonna very quickly introduce and then pass it over to Joanna, who's gonna explain you more what we do. But
okay, Pierre, I'm just going to run through the introduction. I just want to make a housekeeping announcement before we get going. Pierre spent 12 years at the intersection of transportation technology and government, starting in 2007 as an advisor to the French Minister of Transport. And then in 2010, he spent 3 years with France's state-owned railway, SNCF, Air France, and the French presidency. He holds a master from Sciences Po in Paris and an MBA from INSEAD. His colleague, Joanna Patterson, who's also joining us, is head of business development for the eastern half of North America and has been with FLiXBUS since 2018. Prior to joining FLiXBUS, she spent 4 years at McKinsey & Company, and she advised on telecommunications, a variety of topics there. She has an MBA from Harvard Business School and a BA from Dartmouth College, and she grew up in Toronto. Just another quick housekeeping announcement. If you do have questions for our panel, use the raise hand or the Q&A feature. And a reminder the meeting is being recorded. Also a reminder to people who join us later, if you look at the beginning of the chat thread, there is a link to download the agenda and reports for our AGM. That being over with, Pierre, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Terry. Very, very happy to be here among kindred spirits. I think I was a member of Transport Action Canada before even hearing about you. What you guys show in your tireless work to advocate for universal transport access in your country is very similar to what we do. And it was actually very nice in the presentation before to see that Dallas, of all places, is taking such a progressive route in managing its transport network, which reminds us that transport is not about ideology, it's not about politics, and it's purely a matter of basically minimizing dollar cost, carbon cost, and time cost, and while we move people and goods around. And on the other side, you want to be maximizing access, which is mostly information, so that most people know about it and that you can start creating network effects. So we all share the same vision here, and the more I hear and the more I learn about Canada, the more I feel that 3 years ago, when we were looking at the US market and we started our first routes here about 2 years ago, we should have stopped our efforts right there and moved to Canada and launched FLiXBUS in Canada, because it's a much more it's a much more interesting market, and I think we would have done even better in Canada. And the more I learn about it, the more I'm excited about that market and that upcoming launch. I'm gonna let Joanna now take over and explain you guys what we are all about. I just wanted to join in case there are questions. You discussed inclusiveness earlier. In case there are questions in French, we know Canada is a French-speaking country as well, so ravi de répondre à toute question en français ou de donner plus de détails en français pour des personnes que ça pourrait intéresser. And without further ado, Joanna.
Great. I am just going to share my screen. Okay. I will assume that's working. So basically 3 things that I want to talk about today. First is a brief overview of who FLiXBUS is. The second, I have a few slides going over sort of what differentiates us. And I think the third and most exciting piece is why we're excited about Canada and to the US. As Pierre, and I think as Terry mentioned, I'm from Toronto, and my #1 priority since joining Flix has been setting up a bus that can connect me in New York to my parents in Toronto. So I am so on board with getting our bus service to Canada as soon as we can. First, a quick snapshot sort of about Flix and the span of our reach. We basically have a bus network, and to a smaller degree, a train network that spans 30 countries, the majority of which are in Europe, but also includes the US. And so you can sort of see some of the numbers here, but we work with over 300 partners I'll speak about later. They employ over 10,000 drivers, and we've transported over 100 million passengers. And so fairly large, though still relatively new to the US and North America. And then we launched service in the US in sort of mid-2018, and since then have gotten a lot of media impressions. I posted that little Canadian headline on the top, since a bit of press in Canada as well, but are certainly trying to tell more and more people, both in the industry as well as potential passengers, about sort of what we're about and what our vision is for the country and the globe. So our bus network consists of, as you can see, over 300 bus partners across Europe and the US. And how this works is we don't own a single bus or a single train, but we partner with sort of local operators who are the experts on actually operating the buses. And so who these sort of partners typically look like is they're typically sort of small to medium size, anywhere from 5 to 50 buses. The work they do is often a lot of charter work, tour groups, commuter service, often family owned. And as we partner with them, we end up taking up, say, 5 to 20% of revenue. So we aren't going to be their whole business, but we're going to be a nice sort of side chunk of business. And what is appealing to these operators for working with us is we allow them to access a different revenue stream that would be really hard or really expensive to access if they were doing it on their own. For those of you that have any sort of experience in fixed line transportation, some of the regulatory hurdles in terms of getting the authorizations to set up lines and getting permission to pick up and drop off passengers, as well as the investment that you need in marketing to actually tell customers about your line, makes it really prohibitively difficult for a small company to set up a line run. And so we allow sort of folks who wouldn't have those resources or capabilities to enter this market. In addition, it's a nice, smooth revenue stream. We know that charter work can be pretty choppy across the year. And so we say, hey, we can give you this opportunity. It's going to be consistent work sort of every day of the year across the year. And so that's basically what's in it and what we offer to the operators that we work with. And just to provide a bit more detail about the way that we sort of split up responsibilities, is our partners are responsible for operationalizing the routes. So they own the buses, they employ the drivers, they're responsible for the maintenance of the vehicles, and basically we set up the rest. And so we plan the route, we do all of the marketing and the public relations. We make sure that our operators or us have all of the proper authorizations to run and pick up and drop off customers legally. We do pricing, customer service, sell tickets, and then we have the technology and the IT infrastructure that makes it easy for both customers and drivers to sort of use our service. And then as that is referred to here, we have a revenue share model. So the idea is our incentives are aligned, that we both care a lot about providing a great service. And so what we don't want to do is just subcontract operators and pay them a flat fee. We want to say, let's do this together and let's hopefully win together. Yeah, and then on the sort of customer side, we think it's really important to have a consistent product experience for their customers, because our customers aren't going to know if company XYZ or company ABC is picking them up. They're going to be booking on our app and they're going to see that it's FLiXBUS. And so we want to make sure that every time they're getting on one of our buses, they're having a good experience and a consistent experience. And so some of those things that we offer is we want to make sure that they're new buses. We know that particularly in North America, the inner city bus industry doesn't always have the best reputation for really new, great buses and the latest technologies. We want to make sure that the buses show up and they look good and our passengers are going to have a comfortable experience. They are all ADA or wheelchair accessible. We offer Wi-Fi, power outlets, restrooms. So it's all pretty simple, but we think it's important that we provide a consistent quality experience. And then sort of on the technology front, trying to make things as easy as possible. So we have an easy to use customer app where you can sort of very, very quickly book tickets, and then you can actually track your bus, receive a push notification if the bus is running late. And then we have a customer service team that can be reached 24/7, who can serve folks in a number of different languages and help assist customers with things like delays, wheelchair accommodations, etc. So just trying to make it an easy, stress-free, and positive experience for customers. In terms of sort of FLiXBUS's network in North America, as I mentioned, we launched in 2018, and since then we've transported over 2 million passengers to over 150 destinations. So you can sort of see the map of the US on the right-hand side of the page. And so we started on the West Coast with like California, Arizona, Nevada, expanded to Texas after that, and then in the late spring of 2019 launched on the East Coast, sort of in New York where I'm based, and since then have also expanded to the Pacific Northwest as well as down to Florida. As might not come as a surprise, our expansion plans were slowed with COVID this year. And so we needed to take some buses off the road to match the demand, but we are excited to be adding inventory back and eventually move into both the Midwest and Canada, hopefully in the first half of 2021. And then basically the way we look at things and why we're so excited about North America is it's not about sort of fighting for market share with existing players, though inevitably competition does come into play. Where we see as a much bigger opportunity is convincing folks that haven't necessarily taken an inner city bus before that this can be a great way to get around. And so far, our results have proven that. And 63% of our customers had never or rarely taken an inner city bus before, and only 13% had used Greyhound. And so it's really about sort of finding folks, and often it's students or young professionals, but we hope to sort of appeal to everybody and saying, hey, this can be a really affordable, really environmentally friendly and comfortable way to get around. And so the idea is to target the folks in that big gray bucket that's highlighted there. And then, as you all are probably familiar with, Canada has some particularly unique dynamics going on because of the regulation. And so because Canada is so highly regulated and is so difficult to get the provincial authorizations, we've seen sort of much lower supply than we would expect for comparable city pairs and much higher prices. And so the bars on the right-hand side are saying, if we look at Greyhound and Megabus being the sort of two biggest players, and we look at what prices are on average for like Canadian or cross-border routes versus domestic routes, they're significantly higher. And so we feel that this is really doing passengers a disservice and not allowing the sort of market to be as big as it can be. And so we see this as a really big opportunity for us to come in and get more folks who right now there isn't enough service for them, or it's priced at a point that doesn't make sense, and get them on buses. So it's why we're, beyond my family connections, really, really excited about hopefully entering the Canadian market soon. And then finally, we are hopeful and excited to launch in Canada in hopefully the not too far future. And so the three provinces we're looking at to start are British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, and are working sort of with operators and the provincial governments on those applications. And so know that these are some long processes, but are optimistic that we'll be able to launch service in Canada in not too long. So that is it for all of the slides I have.
Thank you, Joanna. That was a wonderful presentation. That's a really interesting statistic that the prices are that much higher for bus services in Canada. I have one question that's come in from our audience, which is, do you think you could work with Go Transit and other regional municipal transit agencies? Because historically, these organizations have actually been fairly defensive of their operational turf.
And we see ourselves as typically like a complement to some of the municipal services. And so we're not offering like intra-city service within the service. What we want to do is connect with the sort of local transit networks and allow people to get further. And so as we look at the stations that we set up, we want them to be near transit hubs, and encourage people to sort of take transit to our stations. In Toronto, we'll set up a few different stops and then take you sort of where you want to go. And so certainly the idea is always to work closely with the governments. I had a meeting with the sort of Ministry of Ontario, the transportation folks, to talk some of that through, but certainly we want to partner and work with all of the authorities as best we can.
That's great. Peter Myasik, I believe you have a question, so go ahead.
Yes, I'm going to ask it verbally. I think you could probably hear me because I can't get the Q&A to work. I think my question is really for Kristoffer, and I was too late to get in. So Kristoffer, I've heard from some micro transit providers that even pre-pandemic, there was reluctance by strangers to share small vehicles. You know, so the co-mobility where you have, you know, one person going to the office, one person going to the hospital, etc., ran into some issues here and there in North America with this reluctance to be in a cramped small vehicle. It's probably way worse with COVID now, of course. But do you have a comment on it? Has that been at all seen in Dallas or other places?
No, I mean, obviously, we're operating in very special times here with COVID that we dynamically restrict passenger loads and whatnot. But before that, no, we haven't seen there. There's obviously some. There are obviously some services where, for example, some services where we're looking at doing specialized school transportation in, for example, in the Oslo area. There are some, you know, special instances where, for example, one, for whatever type of reason, one kid cannot be in the vehicle with another kid or something like that. So there are special cases that we do take care of, but on a broader scope than that, we haven't really seen anything.
Just one question, if I may follow up. So within Dallas, if you have the information, what percentage of trips are shared between strangers versus just a unique one person, one vehicle, which is obviously the wrong way to go?
Yeah. I don't have those numbers right in front of me. I can get back to you on those, but I do know that they're fairly high. Obviously lower now these days.
Yeah. I'm talking
but yeah, no, they're usually pretty good. But that being said, there are, you know, different services would configure them to be different ways, because when it comes to these more demand responsive services, it's all kind of a balancing act. You know, you cannot have kind of the on-time performance with that the guys that at FLiXBUS can do in a fully demand responsive service, right?
Yes.
So it's kind of a balancing act of how you actually do that. But I can get back to you on the specific numbers.
Great, thank you, Kristoffer. I believe David Jeans, you have a question for Joanna. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I do. And I think Peter's problem was that those of us who are registered panelists can only answer questions. We can't ask questions through the Q&A. But in any case, my question for Joanna is that you seem to set a fairly high entry barrier for the quality of vehicles, the fact that they should be, you know, less than 3 years old and with Wi-Fi and washrooms and power and so on. Is that in fact a barrier for some of the smaller, like family companies that you'd like to collaborate with, or are most organizations that you deal with able to meet those requirements?
So typically it hasn't been a barrier, and what helps them is we are offering folks a schedule where they can sort of fully utilize the bus for a number of years, and our history is such that when we've entered markets, we won't exit. And so when they're able to basically go to a bank and say, hey, I have this agreement, it's going to be good for 3 years or 5 years, and I'm going to be running X kilometers per year, and because they're going to be able to use it for that much and there's so much expected revenue, they typically haven't had issues getting financing.
Yeah, I know, because it was an innovation a few years ago when regional bus services were introduced in suburban Toronto that for the first time, you know, had Wi-Fi available, so that you know, commuters who like to be able to do things on their laptops on the trip to work actually had the use of that. And I certainly found it was useful having those capabilities available on Greyhound and on the bus services that connected from downtown Toronto to Pearson Airport, for example. You know, it's those high-end features really make a difference, particularly when you're targeting business travelers and trying to get them to use a bus service, which of course traditionally many people have looked down their noses at that kind of shared transportation.
Exactly. And often the trickiest thing for folks to get is the wheelchair accessible bus, because a lot of the smaller operators, you don't need to have it for your charter work. And I know the rules recently changed in Canada, but we do feel that it's really important that all of our buses are wheelchair accessible. So that's typically the trickiest part, but it's overcomable.
That's great to hear. I have one more question for you, which is that we had our last AGM where Mike Cassidy from Maritime Bus spoke that when Greyhound pulled out of Western Canada, that actually had fallout from coast to coast, severed vital connections for through passengers and the package side of the business. And every single company in the industry took a huge hit to their bottom line. Canada also has fewer throughway bus connections with rail than we see in the United States. So have you discussed complementary and feeder services with Via Rail? And can you talk about your approach to interline connectivity?
Pierre, do you want to take this one, or I can grab it?
We haven't had any discussion with Via Rail at that stage. The way those things usually go is that until you start running and until you exist, people won't really take the role. However, we see in Europe, we see a very strong interconnection between different and intermodality. That's why we ended up also launching our own train service, FLiXTrain, with some partners as well. And we see that basically the common foe is the car here, and anything that takes people out of the car, we benefit from collaborating rather than competing with each other. And right now we are working on what would be more of a marketplace product, where we would actually be able to sell other means of transportation and even other bus companies on our site. So I was saying to someone recently, if I'd be able to sell Greyhound, if we'd be able to sell Greyhound on the FLiXBUS site, at the end of the day, since our online experience is quite stronger than that of Greyhound, especially in Canada, we might just through a better streamlined sales process, we might be able to actually bring more people to the bus and easier to use app, etc. And even then, maybe the bus is a Greyhound. We are happy because more people travel by bus, and over time they will slowly switch to FLiXBUS. So we're quite agnostic. At the end of the day, what we want is people to basically use public and shared mobility rather than own car, which in North America is really the big enemy.
Great, thank you very much for that answer. I also know that you have partnered with Autocar Dominique in France to launch the first electric long-distance bus routes in Europe. And
Yes.
in North America, both batteries and hydrogen are in contention as technology options for greener motor coaches. How do you view the opportunities and challenges of each of those things?
Joanna, you want to take it, or I can take it as well?
You can take this one.
Okay. And the electric works on that line, Amiens-Paris, works really well. It's a short route. It's about 100 something kilometers, and it wouldn't work, for instance, on most of our good routes in France, which are in the 200 to 500 kilometer range. So it's still limited by the range of the buses. We actually run a pilot in the US, and we run the first electric MCI that was produced. MCI is a big North American coach manufacturer, from San Francisco to Sacramento and back, and the bus could handle it. So in the US, where those short routes are a bit more common, say Sacramento, San Francisco, San Diego to LA, but also Philadelphia to New York, Philadelphia to Baltimore, a lot of those northeast corridors, when you break them down, you can put more electric there. So electric works for those shorter commutes. But if you are a partner, it won't, and you are the one buying the bus, it doesn't give you the flexibility to say, hey, I'm gonna do Philadelphia, New York, but then maybe after a year, I'm gonna optimize my fleet and switch that bus to, say, charter work, or switch that bus to, say, trip to go to Boston on a daily basis, also with FLiXBUS, but then it doesn't work anymore. So we still see that lack of range as hindering flexibility, as well as to a certain extent cost, although we did run a business case, and since maintenance would be much cheaper and the buses run so many miles, and if you end up managing, and this same in France, even though the bus is more expensive, the gas cost goes, and just like buying your energy goes down. So it, from an economic perspective, it would actually work, even if you factor in the cost of installing new infrastructure at the bus station, at the bus yard. But it only works if you invest 6 to 8 or 10 vehicles. So you need a bit more scale. And since the flexibility is not there, most partners will be loath to do it. Hydrogen answers the range question, and on a similar scale, also answers the economic question. So as a company, if you ask the leadership of FLiXBUS today, we are investing more in hydrogen than in electric, because the outcome is the same: cleaner transportation, at a lower per kilometer seat energy and dollar cost at the end of the day. But we can do that on a longer distance, and you see how agile we are as a company. We need that flexibility, and today electricity is not really able to provide it. So our bet will go on hydrogen for long distance buses.
Okay, it's just 5 minutes past 2 now. So we did promise our panelists we would wrap this up at about 2. So Pierre, Joanna, and Kristoffer, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this afternoon. It's been very informative and very helpful. Thank you. And what we're going to do now is just take a short intermission for 2 or 3 minutes, give everybody who has been sitting here for the last hour a chance to get up and have a little break, and then we'll come back with the business part, call to order for the business part of the agenda at 2:10. Thank you.